Yay.
Anyway,
Thank you, Lynn Slaughter, for
I'm Lynn
speaking to us
Slaughter.
today.
Speaking to us today, I'm Lynn, and I write young adult, obviously, and I call my books coming of age romantic mysteries, which is sort of a mouthful, but that's what I write. So I'm going to be talking to you today about writing young adult fiction, especially realistic fiction, which is my genre. So probably we should start out by talking about what young adult or YA fiction is. And that's really easier said than done. Uh, in his book, Young Adult Literature from Romance to Realism, Michael Cart says it's about as easy to define young adult literature as it is to nail Jell-O to the wall. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that it's really not. Oh, hi, Debbie.
Hello.
Hi.
Sorry I'm late.
That's okay. We're so glad to see you. Okay.
I'm having trouble with my Zoom.
Oh, okay.
So go ahead. I don't want to interrupt. I'll listen.
Okay. All right. So anyway, he says it's very hard. And the reason that it's very hard is that young adult is not actually a genre at all. What it refers to is the age group, that these are books aimed at a particular age group, which is generally defined as ages 12 to 17, sometimes as high as 18. But the thing is that that age group is not the only people who are reading and buying these books. Some readers are as young as age 10, and over half of the people buying young adult books are adults. And some studies indicate that close to 80% of these people who are buying these books, these adults, are actually buying them for themselves to read. So you have a sort of an interesting audience there. All kinds of genres are represented in YA fiction. You name it, and it's in there. So we have horror and science fiction and dystopian fantasy, mystery, romance, thrillers, very big right now, historical fiction, and all sorts of combinations of stuff. Everything from the Hunger Games, which I know you're familiar with, to Harry Potter, which pretty much revolutionized lots of things when it came out in '97, to contemporary realistic novels like Karen McManus's mysteries. You know, the One of Us is Lying. You've probably heard about that one that's been on the bestsellers list forever. Or Jenny Han's Romances to All the Boys I've Loved Before series. So we have this huge array of books that are young adult fiction. What they tend to have in common is the overarching theme of coming of age. The character is actually growing up or maturing during the story. So, for example, in my YA novel that a lot of you are familiar with, Leisha's Song, Leisha doesn't just solve the mystery of what happened to her missing teacher, and she doesn't just fall in love for the first time. She also learns she has to stand up for herself. She loves her grandfather, but she recognizes that she can't live the life that he has scripted for her, and that she has to work to carve out her own journey. In YA fiction, emotions are on steroids. And you probably remember this from your own teenage years. It's full of firsts: first love, first betrayal, first heartbreak. It's a very emotional period. And teens today are under just enormous pressure, not only from rampant bullying that's made 1,000 times worse by the advent of social media, but the pressure to succeed, to have the right extracurriculars, have the right SAT scores, have the right grades to get into a good college, all with no guarantee that it will make much of a difference to their futures anyway, because they are growing up in a world that's beset by a lot of problems. Growing inequality, the specter of climate change, violence, the fallout from systemic racism, homophobia, and xenophobia. Not to mention that right now we're in a pandemic. It's probably then no surprise that empowerment is a big feature of YA books. Many are centered on teens on solo quests to save the world or overcome the forces of evil. But even if teens are not saving the world in these books, when their characters resolve their own conflicts, survive their own heartbreaks, and recover from their own struggles, that is very empowering and appealing to teens who may not feel very powerful at this point in their lives themselves. And while YA doesn't necessarily have a happily ever after ending where everything gets neatly tied up, it does generally end with hope. Some type of hope that things are getting better or that they will. So that's a big feature. Okay, why should you write for young adults? All right, when people ask me that question, a lot of people say, well, when are you going to write a grown-up book, like a book for adults? And young adult writers don't like that. But when I get asked that question, I usually say, well, teens have always been my favorite age group to work with in my career. I'd spent a lot of time working with them. And also, ever since I read my stepmom's copy of 17th Summer, which was published in 1942 and is widely considered the first truly young adult book aimed specifically for a teen readership, I just continued reading and loving YA novels right into adulthood by luminaries like Lois Duncan, Richard Peck, Judy Blume, Mildred Taylor, Sarah Dessen, all of these people. But beyond my personal interest in YA literature, especially contemporary realistic, which is what I write, there are very important reasons to invest in writing for this age group. YA author Gail Forman, she's the one you probably are familiar with because it was made into a movie, If I Stay, about a young woman whose entire family was wiped out in a car accident. She's the only survivor, and she has to make a decision as to whether she's going to go on. But anyway, Gail Forman calls these novels wonderful empathy delivery devices. Books can take readers into the interior lives of characters in ways that television and video cannot. In addition to fostering empathy and understanding of the struggles of others, books can offer comfort to those who are going through hard stuff. As award-winning YA author Chris Crutcher notes, he says, I have never met a depressed person or an anxious person or a fearful person who was not encouraged by the knowledge that others feel the same way they do. And that really is true. And empathy and understanding of others in our increasingly diverse world has never been more important. A recent study indicated, and I thought this was scary, that there was a 40% decline in empathy among college students and a 68% increase in narcissism compared to 3 decades ago. Nearly 1 in 3 adolescents develops an anxiety disorder by the age of 18. At least 1 in 4 has been victimized by an abusive dating partner. And more than 1/4 of students say they've been bullied at school. It's kind of astonishing to me. It's a cliche to say that young adult novels provide both windows and mirrors, but it's true. The mirror aspect has to do with the fact that young people often think that they are the only ones going through what they are going through, especially if they've been marginalized in some way or treated like an outsider by their peers. The windows aspect, in turn, allows readers to see into the lives and minds and hearts of others, and it helps teach empathy. This is one reason why the trend toward more diversity in YA fiction, which is a major, major trend, is so beneficial. Teens grow in understanding and appreciation of the struggles of kids who come from different socioeconomic classes, racial and ethnic groups, and who are coming to terms with their sexual orientations and their gender identities. And teens from marginalized groups benefit from, at last, seeing teens in books who look like them and are going through some of their same struggles. There's also evidence that young adult fiction can be beneficial in classroom settings, that they can promote higher levels of engagement and give teachers a segue to talk about difficult topics with their students. Moreover, anything that we can do to encourage teens to read is a really good thing. We know that reading is connected to success in school and life. According to research by the American Psychological Association, in 1984, 64% of teens reported that they read often. In recent years, less than 20% of US teens report reading a book, a magazine, or a newspaper daily for pleasure, while more than 80% use social media every day. And when I was teaching at IUS, and I would ask my freshmen, how many of you like to read? And maybe only 2 or 3 people out of, a classroom of 20 kids would say they like to read. Far too many of our children, in fact, are unable to read at a proficient level. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, between 1998 and 2015, reading scores for 12th graders declined. More than 60% were not proficient readers. So, suppose you decide, well, okay, I'm down with this. I think I'll take a stab at writing young adult fiction. This seems like a good thing to do. How should you prepare? As with anything else, you need to do some research. And the best place to start is with yourself. Because while the world has changed quite a bit, feelings that you had in adolescence have not. So I would advise getting in touch with that vulnerable side of yourself and getting back in touch with the pain, the anguish, and the intense feelings you experienced as an adolescent. Take a look at your high school yearbook. I did that last week, and oh my gracious. Listen to the music that can transport you back to that time in your life. All I have to do is hear Johnny Mathis singing Chances Are, and I am immediately drawn back into those parties where I just prayed that my crush of the week would ask me to slow dance. It was a big deal. Do some thinking and writing about memories that really stand out for you in that period of time. For me, this came up last week because I got an email from somebody who had worked on my high school yearbook with me. I was editor of our yearbook. And this was very traumatic for me. I didn't know what, at that time, I was pretty innocent. I didn't even know what sexual harassment was, but I was being hit on by the faculty advisor at that time, and I was terrified. And I have so many very painful memories of that whole period. At any rate, you can ask yourself questions. When did you feel the most misunderstood, betrayed? What was the most unfair thing that happened to you? For me personally, I don't want to get into too much TMI where, oh my God, all she did was talk about herself. But my senior year, my father would not allow me to take dance classes because he was afraid I would go into dance. He did not think that was intellectual enough, and or that I would ever make a living. And so that was a very, very painful time for me. Of course, you know what happened. I went on to have a 40-year career in dance, but it doesn't really work to tell your kids not to do something.
That's true.
But anyway,
So true.
you can also think about in what way your upbringing seemed different compared to your peers. My mom was mentally ill. I didn't have a mom. I did get a stepmom later on, but I remember being very aware of that when you're in school and everybody's making the Mother's Day cards and you're thinking, what do I do now? Okay, You can also think about what's the biggest mistake you've ever made, the loneliest time, your most embarrassing moment. Boy, did I have a few of those. Of course, the world is very different, as I said, today from the one that we grew up in. So we also need to do some research on contemporary teens, and that means spending time with them if you possibly can. So I've been very fortunate. As I say, a lot of my life I was working with teens, I was teaching at a performing arts high school, yada yada, and now I'm a volunteer sexuality educator, and so I'm continuing to work with teens, and that's I think has been very lucky for me. Some even advise sitting in malls or coffee shops and eavesdropping, but I think you have to be careful about that.
Yes. You're a pervert.
Yes. I don't know if I agree with that advice. I would think it's a little too stalkery for me, but you can still pick up stuff. You know, I'm sure Elaine, walking through the bookstore, you've heard conversations and you've picked up stuff. You know, just hearing people talk. Of course, Jeanette's an educator, so she's been working with lots and lots of young people. So she's had a real
experience with eighth graders.
A real experience.
A real.
Yes. Yeah, eighth graders. That's it. Okay. You can also check out things online like teen YouTube stars to get a sense for their language. If you want to write about a teen struggling with a particular issue, it's good to try to track one down and talk to them. And of course, you have to read YA young adult novels, lots of young adult novels, particularly ones that have been published, say, in the last 5 years. Because again, what is sort of, you know, going to relate to your contemporary audience, you have to think about, it's not going to be like the ones that maybe we read as kids. It's going to be, the YA field is going to be really different now. There are also a number of craft books, you know, specifically about writing for young adults that are available. And I've put together a little handout, which I will get out to you, that lists some of those. All right, so you've done your research. You're ready to dive in. You want to do this. All right, so what are some important do's and don'ts? Well, first of all, your novel has to be told from the perspective of a teenage protagonist. If you're writing as an adult looking back at your teenage years, then you are writing a book for adults, not for teens. Also, you have to keep in mind that in general, young adult readers will read about protagonists who are their same age or older than they are, but not younger. You'll need to decide whether you want to gear your novel toward younger tweens and teens, that's kind of the 11 to 14-year-olds, or aim for older teens in high school. Young YA, and you'll see even in the library, it'll have a YT on it when you're borrowing that book, or an OT, that means for older teens. You'll see that the young YA tends to shy away from graphic description. There's little to no cursing. Edgy YA for older teens may include more graphic descriptions of sex, violence, drugs, and may use strong language. For both, the pace is very brisk. It moves very fast, and emotions, as I mentioned, are very intense. You also need to be clear on whether you're writing a middle grade novel or a young adult novel, because there's some overlap in the younger YA category. Middle grade novels are typically aimed at 9 to 12-year-olds. They're shorter in length, generally 30 to 50,000 words, as compared to YA fiction, which is usually between 50 and 80,000 words, and even longer if it's science fiction or fantasy, because of all the world building involved. It can go quite long. Middle grade books have fewer subplots, and romance is more likely to be puppy love. They don't usually contain profanity or graphic violence, and the protagonists are usually between the ages of 10 and 13. Middle grade books tend to be about characters reacting to external situations and events, typically around friendships, school situations, family relationships, siblings, physical changes that they're going through. Think Judy Blume or Are You There For Me, God? Or whatever, you remember that. And a growing awareness of the world outside of themselves and its injustices. Stacey Barney, an editor at Putnam, says that middle grade readers and characters are often looking outside of themselves for the first time, questioning why things are the way they are. During the YA years, readers and characters are often looking within, questioning, who am I and what does that mean? There's a lot more self-reflection and internal angst in general in YA as compared to middle grade. YA novels are often told in first person, and increasingly first person present tense to give a sense of immediacy and intimacy, whereas middle grade novels are often still written in third person. For YA, voice, the personality in which your character speaks and thinks and feels, is really, really important. Often, that voice may be somewhat sarcastic and snarky, not always, but sometimes. After all, teens are figuring out that adults don't know what they're doing either, okay? And they recognize the unfairness of many, many things in the adult world, which is one reason why rebellion against authority is a popular and recurring theme. But it's important to note that not all teens are snarky, and like adults, they all don't speak alike or think alike. So it's very important to differentiate your characters. Your readers, above all, want a character that they can relate to and identify with. It's the emotional journey your characters take that is going to resonate with them most of all. It's important for your characters to have strengths as well as flaws. It's comforting and reassuring to teens that they aren't alone in their struggles and shortcomings. So, just like with adult fiction, you don't want to create flat, stereotypical characters. You don't want to have the dumb blonde cheerleader who's, epitomizes superficiality. You don't want to have the nerdy geek. You want to dig deeper. Teens are like us, they're complicated. And often, how they are perceived or labeled by others has very little to do with how they are feeling on the inside. Sometimes, their recognition that other teens are more complicated than they thought initially from their judgments, and teens do tend to make snap judgments about people, is part of their growing up process. So in my novel, While I Danced, for example, Cass, who's the heroine, initially dismisses her frenemy Missy as shallow and superficial because Missy wears a lot of makeup and she always has to have the newest clothing and always has to be very concerned about her glamorous appearance. But when those two are thrown together at an intense dance workshop, she realizes that there's a whole lot more to Missy than she assumed just by looking at how she presents to the outside world. It's also very important not to preach or condescend. If a teen smells an adult in there, telling them what they should do or believe, end of game, total turnoff. They get enough preaching and lecturing from adults in their everyday lives. They read to understand their friends, their frenemies, and above all, themselves. They don't want to be patronized. Likewise, it's very important not to let adults take over or save the day. Your teen protagonists must be the stars of their own stories. So, for example, in my novel, It Should Have Been You, it's Clara who figures out the identity of her twin's murderer, not the adult homicide detective. And it's Clara who saves herself from an abusive kidnapper before the cavalry arrives. It's also a good idea to avoid or limit too many cultural references. That group or pop star may be considered very passé by the time your book comes out. Likewise, go easy on the teen slang. You don't want to date your book, and again, by the time your book comes out, the slang will probably have changed. When is the last time you heard a teen say, groovy, man? Okay? So don't do that. It's best to write what you feel passionately about rather than to try to write to trends. Again, trends come and go. And by the time you try to sell your vampire novel, because vampires are hot right now, vampires may be out of fashion. Besides which, you guys know this, we write our best books when we write about what we really care about and what interests us. I also advise not shying away from edgy stuff. The internet and social media have exposed kids to a tremendous amount of information. As I mentioned earlier, I didn't know what sexual harassment was. Well, today's teens know what that is.
Yes, yeah,
They talk about harassment, rape culture, body image, abuse, racism, drugs, xenophobia, alcohol, sex. These are all topics that they talk about. In their daily lives, they may be experiencing bullying, gossip, drugs, assault, depression, you name it. Besides which, during middle and high school, teens are becoming much more aware of the darker underbelly of life. Someone they know starts cutting. Someone they know gets pregnant. Someone they know dies. Fiction can be a way of dealing with the anxieties of living in a world that isn't all sweetness and light. Okay, romance is not required, but keep in mind that romantic attraction is very high on most teens' minds. Those hormones are raging, all right? And most teens are interested in romance, but many lack real-life romantic experience. So novels that include romance are a great way to vicariously experience something readers are longing for or are wondering about for their own lives. Also, as with adult fiction, it's a good idea to pay attention to combining both internal and external conflict so you can ramp up the tension for your story. So in my novel, Deadly Setup, for example, Sam's external conflict has to do with fighting to prove her innocence after she goes on trial for the shooting death of her mother's fiance. But her internal conflict stems from her longing for a family. Her father has died, and she loves her remaining parent and wants to protect her, but she is struggling with the growing realization that her mother is not capable of being emotionally present or supportive of her. Finally, I just want to say that I think it's really important to respect and genuinely care about teenagers, and if you want to write books for and about them. Do not think of YA fiction as dumbed down adult fiction, because it's not. Contemporary teenagers may not have the same extensive life experiences that we do as adults, but they are pretty sophisticated readers. And some of the best writing today comes from young adult authors. So that's all I have to say. And now I think we should open it up for comments or questions. Anything that you want to talk about in terms of this topic. Okay, that's not promising. All right. Yes.
Say I really appreciate this, and I, as an avid lover of Harry Potter from way back, I mean,
Yes.
very good books, and you know, things I read alongside with Mitchell when he was in that age group.
Yes.
And it was so important to me for him to read. So if he said, "This is a really good book, Mom, I want you to read it," I would read it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
And
I think it's
a great way to connect with your kid.
It is. And yeah, I think you shed a lot of light on that. And a lot of what you said is true of any writer. You know, it doesn't
That's right.
Yeah, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, basically, all these things are, well, all these things are things that we are working on with our adult fiction. Of course, we want to have internal and external conflict, and of course, we want fully developed three-dimensional characters, and of course, we want a voice, that people can identify with. So a lot of this is going to be true whether you're writing for young people or adults. Jeanette, why don't you describe some of what you observed about your eighth graders?
Oh, boy. For one thing, what I had in mind, it was my first experience with them. What I had in mind was carrying to the classroom with me was my eighth grade experience and what
Yes.
my expectations. But what I got was a whole different
Right.
ball game to
Right.
do with culture, to do with
Yes.
how they interact with each other.
Yes. Right.
I had to, like for the first 2 weeks, introduce them how they would talk to Miss Pope. I am not your friend, and we can't use some of the language that you do with your peers. That was 2 weeks of that.
Yeah.
Okay. And after that, I had to bring myself down some from the adult expectations, like the respect. I do want them to respect me, but I do want to leave the door open where you can talk to me about anything. Y'all want to be approachable.
That's right.
But then I had to instill myself for things that they deal with that I never did. And it
Yes.
just shocked me. Like we had a persuasive piece to write.
Yes.
How would you like to spend, you try to persuade your mom to let you spend the night at your parents. And we were talking about the part of what, you're asking for, and then the part of what the bargaining tool.
Yes.
Well, I got through all of that. I got the papers back, and they all explained about how they was going to ask and, what reasoning they was going to give to spend, besides having fun, you might want to study or whatever.
Right.
But what I didn't get back was the bargaining part. And I asked them about that, and they said, she doesn't care whether we, I don't have to bargain with her. She doesn't care. I could just go and spend the night, anytime, anywhere. I was like, I was going through, like, you call the other parent to see if someone's going to be at home,
Right.
if there's any guns in the home, that sort of thing that I would do.
Yeah.
None of that happens. And I had to bring myself down from not being shocked at that to realize that this is their world. This is what some of them, and some of these children came from parents that had lots of money. When I talked, their clothes that they wore, I couldn't afford.
Right.
But the culture, the things that they said to me, things are just different. The things that they go through and accept, it will horrify me at eighth grade.
Yeah.
So some of the things that I had to steel myself from not being judgmental,
Yes.
and acceptance, and if they had a problem, to guide them, but they are more sexually, they know more things to say and do. And I'm like, oh no, the swimming pool was a thing, believe me. Oh, my God. But I got my lessons the first week, and I had to readjust everything, to approach them in a different way than being judgmental or preachy, like, don't untie her top. What is going on with you, boy? So that sort of thing.
Right.
Instead of being horrified and march him off to the principal, because actually, as soon as I said it, they stopped.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was something. It really was.
Yeah. I definitely think, well, eighth grade, I think that's probably, to me, the epitome of very, very challenging age.
It really is.
It really is very challenging. They are just struggling in that transition between
And not to mention the schools that they go to. Most of them went to private schools.
Yes.
Or the new boys school that opened here.
Yes.
And the pressure was there for them from their parents.
Yeah.
For them to perform, to be the best, to be better, and you could tell as soon as they made a mistake, they were like in writing. I taught writing for them. And, and when they made a mistake, it would just freak them completely out. They would want me to see their paper because this is a mistake. why do you think they call me teacher? You know,
Right. Right.
so and the pressure is on them. It's I have to do this. I have to play this kind of sport to be able to get in
That's
a
right.
good high school, or
That's right.
to do this and to do that. I have to have this and I have to have that. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of pressure on
It's a
them.
lot of pressure. It's a lot of pressure. And you know, I've had students say to me, I wish my mother or father cared. You know,
Yeah,
and that's very painful when
that is too. And then
when
the
they say
boys
that.
are made to be men. They don't cry.
Right. Oh,
I'm
yeah.
tough, and I'm like, you stump your toe, it hurts, cry. If it
Right.
hurts, cry. There's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with that,
Yeah.
please.
There's still so much of that, isn't there? So much pressure on boys
It is. It
uh,
really is.
to be sort of a stereotypical male
Right. That
role.
males don't do this and they
And
don't do that.
yeah, yeah. So I think that's hard. I think it's hard to be a guy. I think it's hard to be a girl.
It really is.
Really, they have their different challenges. Well, it's so good to have an educator here to be able to tell us what it's like in the trenches. Um, you
Yes.
know, but is there anything else anybody wants to ask me about? Anything you're curious about?
A quick
Um,
question. What do you
yes.
think as far as YA is the biggest new trend? I know you said there's a lot of diversity, there's as much as for adults, but what's the newest trend that seems to be catching the attention of teens?
What a great question. Well, I read an article that said, let's see, obviously diversity is huge right now. So that's very, very big. But also fantasy is still very popular. Mystery thrillers are definitely having their moment. I read one article that said rom-coms because people need escape from the pandemic. I looked at the also there's a growing interest in graphic novels. Graphic novels are big now, really big. I looked at the New York Times YA hardcover bestsellers list, and in the top 10, 3 were fantasy, 4 were mystery thrillers, 1 was general fiction, and 2 were nonfiction. The number one, there's a really, and 3 of them were about diversity or had diverse heroes or heroines. The number 1 bestseller, Firekeeper's Daughter, that's about a Native American young woman investigating a drug ring in her tribal community. Angie Thomas's Concrete Rose, that's a prequel to The Hate U Give. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that book. But that's about her father. When he was growing up, he was a young black man in a gang, and when he found out that he was going to become a father, he began changing his life. That's on the bestsellers list. Stamped by Jason Reynolds and Ibram Kendall. That's an exploration of racism and anti-racism in America, and that's one of that's in the top 10 of the bestsellers. So it's hard to say. For a while, dystopian was the rage. I don't think dystopian is as big as it was, although it may have been making somewhat of a comeback during the pandemic. I'm not sure. Elaine, what are you noticing in the bookstore?
To your point that you started off with, one of the points you started, we sell an awful lot of what's in our young adult section.
Yes.
Mid-20s to 30s,
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of the girls I work with, the young women I work with,
Yeah.
every new book that comes out they buy. Right now I think that I'm selling more fantasy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Fantasy's big.
And they're huge books. They're huge books.
Yes.
And they just devour them.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is something for them.
And what is fantasy? Just are we talking like, is that like vampires or is it like a science fiction or is it?
Tolkien and the Hobbits and you know, Harry Potter, that kind of a world, rather than science fiction, which has more technical, you know, possibilities to it. Yeah, we for some, well, there's a lot of things we've done that I don't understand. For a long time, I didn't understand why we had science fiction and fantasy together, and now we've separated again. You know, so go figure. I think they just like us to move books.
But when you go in the bookstore, it is interesting because they really are definitely, now you'll see a fantasy adventure section, and you will see a realistic section. You may also see a romance section. You'll see a graphic novels section. I mean,